In this video, we're going to be going over lipid metabolism, and in particular, we're going to look at ketone bodies. Well, as your body breaks down adipose tissue, which primarily consists of triglycerides, you're going to get fatty acids from these cells, and the body can use these fatty acids as an energy source. What we're going to see is that during the breakdown of fatty acids, you can get ketone bodies. Shown here in this pathway, you get acetyl-CoA from the fatty acids, and this acetyl-CoA can be used to make ketone bodies. So not only is fatty acids used as an energy source, but a small portion of that can be made into ketone bodies. And ketone bodies is an alternative energy source. So we're going to look at ketone bodies and the clinical aspects that surrounds these. A key word in lipid metabolism is lipolysis. And this is the process of breaking down lipids. When we use this term, it usually refers to the breakdown of triglycerides into free fatty acids and glycerol. Well, this breakdown uses enzymes and water in the process called hydrolysis. Hydrolysis means breaking apart, which is lysis, and you're breaking apart with water. Here we have an adipocyte, and within that adipocyte is the fat droplet, which consists primarily of triglycerides. Well, when you break the triglyceride down in order to use this as an energy source, you use water and enzymes, and you break it down into 3 fatty acids and glycerol. When this bond breaks, these hydrogens bind on here to where the bond has broken, and then the OH group bonds over to here. And so we're using water to break down these triglycerides, hence the name hydrolysis. Well, some of the free fatty acids are converted to an alternative energy source by the liver primarily, which are known as ketone bodies. The term ketone bodies usually refers to these 3 molecules, and you want to make sure you star these. So when I ask you about the ketone bodies, you should be able to name these 3. We have acetoacetic acid, beta-hydroxybutyric acid, and acetone. Acetoacetic acid is also called acetoacetate, and beta-hydroxybutyric acid is also called beta-hydroxybutyrate. So you want to be aware of this in case you see these in other sources. If you give the names of these and you use acetoacetate or beta-hydroxybutyrate, those are fine to use instead of acetoacetic acid and beta-hydroxybutyric acid. It's kind of good to use acid because ketone bodies we're going to see are going to lower the pH. And so knowing that it's an acid can help you to understand how it lowers the pH. Acetone, besides being produced by the body, is also the primary solvent in nail polish remover. And again, you get a small numbers of ketone bodies during normal lipid metabolism, or breakdown of these fatty acids. Ketone bodies are used as an energy source by many organs, such as the heart and the brain, and are normally found in the serum or in the blood in relatively low concentrations. So it's normal to have ketone bodies. But if you have abnormally high levels of ketone bodies, then that's when problems can happen. Glucose is the main energy source for the brain. Unlike most other tissues, the brain cannot use fatty acids for energy when blood glucose levels become low. And in this case, ketone bodies are going to provide the brain with an alternative fuel source or energy source. Elevated levels of ketone bodies in the blood results in a condition called ketosis. So if you have above normal levels of ketone bodies, we call that ketosis. And this can be certainly normal. You will have various times that you will have ketosis because you have an increased number of ketone bodies, such as you can have a mild to moderate elevation of circulating ketone bodies in response to fasting or prolonged exercise, or a ketogenic or high-fat diet. The problem is that if you have excess amounts of ketone bodies, pathological ketosis causes a dangerous increase in ketone bodies. And if there are enough ketone bodies in the blood to lower the blood pH below normal, then we call this condition ketoacidosis. If ketoacidosis is a result of diabetes mellitus, it's known as diabetic ketoacidosis or DKA. This is also another term you want to star. It's important to realize that just because somebody's in ketosis doesn't mean they're in ketoacidosis. Ketosis just means an increased level of ketone bodies. If there's enough ketone bodies that it lowers the pH below normal, then we refer to that as ketoacidosis. So everyone who is in ketoacidosis is also in ketosis, but not everyone in ketosis is in ketoacidosis. Well, when you look at the pathological ketosis we see in type 1 diabetes, It's the most common pathological cause of DKA. Type 1 diabetics have low to no insulin, which results in glucose not being able to enter the cells. Here's a cell with its insulin receptor. When insulin binds to that receptor, it's going to trigger these vesicles that have this transport protein in them called GLUT4, or glucose transporter number 4. What's going to stimulate the vesicles to put these into the membrane so that the glucose, which is higher outside the cell, can move through these transporters to inside the cell, thereby lowering the blood glucose level. And there are a number of cells that require this glucose transporter number 4 to move glucose in, and it moves it in by a process called facilitated diffusion. Well, if somebody doesn't have insulin or very low levels of insulin as a type 1 diabetic, then there's no insulin or very little insulin to stimulate this process of putting the GLUT4 transporters into the membrane. So the glucose stays really high because it can't move into the cells. Even though there are high levels of glucose, the body, since it can't move that glucose into these cells, thinks it's starving and starts to break down lots of fat and increases its production of ketone bodies. Type 2 diabetes can cause DKA, but you have to have a really extreme situation to do this. DKA is usually associated with type 1 diabetics and not type 2 diabetics. Although type 2 diabetics can certainly have this, but it's in an extreme situation. Type 2 diabetics have cells with insulin receptors that are not as responsive, or they're insensitive to insulin. And this results in glucose not being able to enter the cell. Because here you have an insulin receptor, and usually a type 2 diabetic can have normal to higher levels of insulin in their blood, at least during the initial phase of type 2 diabetes. We're going to talk a lot about this later on, but for right now, what I want you to know is that it's the receptor that's not responsive to insulin. Thereby, it's not going to stimulate these vesicles to put the GLUT4 transporter into the membrane because the receptor is not responsive to it. So they're going to have really high blood glucose levels as well, but for a different reason. In both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, once that glucose does move into the cell, then these transporters here are going to be put back into vesicles until the next signaling of insulin comes along. Again, we'll talk a lot about this later on when we get to the endocrine system, and we really dive into the details of the different types of diabetes. In severe ketoacidosis, this can lead to coma and death. A person who is in ketosis, or ketoacidosis, may have a fruity or sweet-smelling breath due to the presence of acetone. And you want to star this. Acetone causes that fruity or sweet-smelling breath when you have really high levels of ketone bodies. Your patient's either in ketosis or in ketoacidosis. Acetone is volatile and can leave the blood in exhaled air. So as that blood goes in these capillaries that are surrounding the alveoli, some of that acetone can move into the alveoli and be exhaled. And you can smell that acetone on a breath in somebody who is in ketosis, and especially those in ketoacidosis. So let's test our knowledge. Lipid Metabolism Part 1. Go ahead and pause the video and answer the questions. Here are the answers. Here's Part 2. Pause the video and answer the questions. Here are the answers. Part 3. Pause the video and answer the questions. Here are the answers. Here's Part 4. Go ahead and pause the video and answer the questions. Here are the answers. And that concludes this video. Let me know if you have any questions.